So I'm going to start. I think this really sets the scene, and it's a new video. Some of you have been to our previous events have seen that we've got a pretty dynamic video that really sets the scene for what the industry is. And I think it's a really exciting industry. It's clean, it's green, it's the future. It attracts the next generation, and we've tried to capture that. So in an IMCA video that captures the essence of what we do as an industry, and I think it's great to start by reminding ourselves, what is this all about? What are we actually building? What are we installing in the sea? Well, I think, I joined the industry 40 years ago as a fresh-faced graduate engineer, and that's what excited me about the industry. It was oil and gas, it was at the time, but the chance to go and work on huge construction projects that are changing really, the face of energy. So that's really, I think that's why we're all here, yeah? So meeting global ambitions, and I'm just trying to set the scene for the whole session here. And I found this slide, which came from Wood Mackenzie a couple of months ago, which talks about offshore wind ambitions. And it's the usual market hockey stick, but that is the global ambitions on the right-hand side. So if you start back in, at the left-hand side of the slide here, 2015, for most of that in 2015 to 2020, we were installing about 3 gigawatts of offshore wind. This is outside of China. I mean, China would distort the scale too much here. But in the world, we were installing about 3 gigawatts of offshore wind every year between 2015 and 2020. And if you think in that period, oil and gas was very depressed. So we suffered a major drop in the oil price in around 2016. And virtually all offshore contractors, all suppliers, then turned and focused on offshore wind. So we had this hugely hungry supply chain that were very keen, and we were installing about 3 gigawatts a year. In the last couple of years, we've raised that globally to about 6 gigawatts per year. So you can see a slight increase in sort of 2021, 22, 23. So about 6 gigawatts per year. So that's with today's supply chain. And that's because we're now doing it in Taiwan, we're doing it in the northeast of the US, we're doing it in lots of new countries. The first 3 gigawatts was pretty much all in Europe. So the world stage has expanded now, much more countries. And you can look and see here, this is the dark blue line is global ambitions. So we know that the UK increased their ambition to 50 gigawatts by 2030. The US have got a target of 30 gigawatts by 2030. And if you add up all of those governments' ambitions, by 2030, we have to install 77 gigawatts per year to reach that ambition, from an average of about 3, and today with 6. So if you look at all of that equipment, vessels, and people, and there's not a lot of new equipment getting built. You know, there are some new vessels getting built, but certainly not enough to go from 6 gigawatts per year globally to 77 gigawatts. So global ambitions are unachievable. That's the bottom line. So Wood Mackenzie have said, what is more realistically achievable by 2030? And they've said, probably installing about 30 gigawatts per year is theoretically achievable. With today's assets, today's people, but we're going to have to build a lot more. So we're expecting the supply chain to ramp up and be able to go from installing 6 gigawatts per year today, roughly, to installing, and that's installing per year, 5 times as much by 2030. So we're going to need, and I think they did an investment of another $13 billion in offshore vessels alone. And we're going to need factories to build the turbines. We're going to need factories to build the blades, the monotowers, the foundations, and whatever. So that's a huge ramp up in capability from the supply chain. So the opportunity is huge. The real message here is the ambitions are huge, the opportunity is huge moving forward. But there's a but. But supply chain losses over the last period have been clearly unsustainable. And I'm not picking on any companies, because I could have picked a multitude of headlines over the last 2 or 3 years. We've seen just, you know, everybody struggling, from the installation contractors to the turbine manufacturers. No one has been making fair returns over the last period. So how do those companies go to their shareholders, go to the boards, go to their shareholders, and ask for further investment to invest in vessels, you know, whether it's wind turbine vessels, whether it's foundation installation vessels, whether it's factories? And we've seen that. We've seen vessels cancelled. We've certainly seen factory investment being cancelled over the last period, because the returns are just not there to justify it. And certainly in the last year, we've seen project cancellations. So it's not just the supply chain. Developers have now found that because of the huge growth in demand, COVID, inflation, interest rates, we've seen the cost base effectively has gone up. You know, depends what numbers you look at. Typically, people are talking about a 40% increase in the cost base coming from the supply chain. So most of those projects were, of course, either gained their CFDs or their PPAs probably 2 or 3 years ago, when the supply chain was a different cost base. And the supply chain is also much busier. You know, oil and gas commodity prices are significantly higher than they were. Therefore, that supply chain has now got a choice. That supply chain can choose whether it wants to work in offshore wind or whether it wants to work in oil and gas. And some of those suppliers are definitely moving back, perhaps to their comfort zone, or perhaps to work for clients or work under contracts that are generally fairer, and working for clients that you know, want to see a strong, healthy supply chain. They're not going to bankrupt a company on one project. You know, if you look at the previous one, you know, Sapura went bust. So I don't think there's anybody from Sapura in the room, but you know, they effectively are no longer a supplier. Some of those other major tier 1 contractors are no longer offering lump sum turnkey EPCI type contracts. Publicly, they're saying that in their annual reports. So we're seeing a reduction in the number of players in certain segments of the market. We're seeing cutbacks in the number of investments. So these are the challenges. Huge opportunity I started with, but we're facing challenges today. So this is not new. In my career, in 40 years in the industry, I've seen this. So we've seen in oil and gas, of course, we see peaks and troughs. It's been a characteristic. It's caused me to be made redundant a couple of times in my career when we've had a slump, to be honest. So I've suffered in those downturns as well. But what did the industry do? And this is taking an example back in the early 90s. The oil and gas industry was struggling. It was low commodity rates. I think oil was down around $10, maybe even it dropped below $10 a barrel at that time. So projects were getting cancelled. Costs were too high. Nothing was moving ahead. So the industry came together. The industry came together, and actually it was done in Aberdeen. It was quite a North Sea initiative at the time. The industry came together, both government, energy companies, and the supply chain came together, and they put an initiative together. It was called CRIME, Cost Reduction in a New Area. So that was the industry actually working to try and make a change to make projects move ahead. And that's what we're all here for ultimately, is to get wind projects in the water. And one of the other outcomes that came out of CRIME was LOGIC, so Leading Oil and Gas Industry Competitiveness Programme. And LOGIC, as most people who are involved in contracts today, formed a standard form of contract. So today that's still LOGIC contracts. It's run by OUK, and we've got some OUK colleagues here in the room today. So LOGIC was a standard form of contract, was one of the tools that was developed alongside other tools, and OUK have got their own standard principles for fair contracting as well. So we've seen similar circumstance in our industry, in the offshore marine contracting industry in the past. And that was the industry coming together to form new relationships, standard forms of contract, and even different ways of contracting. If you think about it, it was alliance-type contract that came out where risk and reward were shared, rather than just being a pure LD regime or whatever. There were incentives to deliver, incentives to find cost savings. So it was the industry actually looking for a different form of relationship, not just a hard-nosed contract, but if you look at the end goal and say, this is what we need to do to get this project going ahead, then the developer or the operator, the main contractors and suppliers all came together and said, how can we make that happen? What can we do together, rather than just one party picking an arbitrary price and saying, let's beat the supply chain, let's try to get down to that bottom line. So it was about all the players collaborating and coming together to form a solution. So what has IMCA done? We recognized this was going to be a challenge. We saw it coming more than a year ago. And as Maggie said, last year, the Legal and Contracts Committee spent a lot of time and effort, together with some third parties, to pull together contracting principles. So this actually says, this is actually a copy of the contract, but we published our contracting principles back in January of this year, 28 contracting principles. If you haven't seen them, please download them. But they cover all the key areas that would be expected: getting paid on time, fair cash flow, having fair insurance terms. So we really took the old contracting principles and we brought on board all the lessons learned over the last few years in terms of what the challenges were. And those principles hopefully are now being discussed and used across the industry. Tim Pick, and I don't know how many people here have read Tim Pick's report. So Tim Pick is a lawyer, came from the oil and gas industry, but he was selected by the government. I think it was Boris Johnson who appointed him as the UK offshore wind champion. And he published his report. That was back in, I'm just trying to remember exactly when that came out. It was in the middle of the year, anyway. He spent a year talking to all the players, developers, government, contractors, supply chain, and he produced the report. And there are various things in there: grid connection, permitting and consenting, no surprise, were probably the biggest topics, but he also recognized that contracting was a key challenge for the industry. And I just picked out some of his key comments that are related to today's event. He said, oil and gas terms are generally more commercially balanced. He said, in oil and gas, the use of well-understood and standardized contracts is the norm. So it's typically LOGIC or it's IMCA, for example. And then finally, which really pleased me, was he said that OWIC, which is the Offshore Wind Industry Council, and for those of you who don't know, AJ, stand up. AJ is with IUK. He's involved with OWIC. And so Tim Pick's recommendation was that OWIC and IMCA should work with all the stakeholders with experience and the North Sea Transition Authority to develop sustainable contracting principles for offshore wind. So he actually said that IMCA's contracting principles were a great piece of work and a foundation that could be used to move forward together with the other stakeholders in the industry. So we were referenced a couple of times in that report, which really, really pleased me at the time. So moving on from our contracting principles that were launched in January, the Legal Contracts and Insurance Committee then came together and said, what would be the logical next step? The logical next step was to produce a standard contract, but it's not new for IMCA. Back in 2017, and Margaret will remind me when we first produced the original contracts, but we already have an IMCA standard marine construction contract. That was issued in 2017. It's logic-based, so that contract has been available from IMCA at least since 2017. We also launched one for the provision of ROV support vessel work based on BIMCO. So, we've taken those contracts and we have produced a standard contract that we use for oil and gas contracting, ROV services, and we've also got one for survey support. So this is not something new that IMCA's been doing. We have been supporting the industry with standard forms of contract for a number of years. But what we did last week, and great work from the team throughout this year, was to develop a marine transport installation renewables contract, so a T&I contract. It's logic-based, and it's been tailored specifically for the offshore wind industry. So there should be a copy, I think, on everyone's desk. There's certainly copies here. If there's not one on your desk, please pick one up from reception across there. So we've launched the contract, and as Maggie said, it is version 1. So this contract was developed by the contractors, by our committee, which is formed only of contractors. There are no developers, there are no suppliers. But we want the industry to take it, to try it, and certainly to give us feedback. We wanted to get something out there that was available for consultation, for use, and give us the feedback, because version 2 will be better, as we all know. And that's what we're here today to talk about. Of course, you're going to get more detail on that contract. Please ask the questions today, but continuously tell us what needs to be done for the industry to adopt this. We want the industry to take it forward. So that's a new contract that's just come out. Yeah. 4 weeks ago, some of the people in this room would have been at the Renewables UK Conference Legal and Finance seminar in London here. That's unfortunately me grinning in the face there. And you can't quite see, but there was a Slido question asked here at the beginning of the session, and it said, does the offshore wind industry need a standard offshore set of contracts? 92% of the people in the room said yes, 8% said no. So I think there was close to similar numbers to here, maybe slightly less than 100 people. So 92% response said that the industry needs this, which I was pretty pleased about because we were about to launch a new contract. So I was hoping they didn't say no, that we don't need them. But 92% yes. Now the second question was, can we adopt it? Are we going to be able to do it? There was a 50-50 response, exactly down the middle, because they said, we've tried this before. We've tried this before in offshore wind. It didn't work. But in my view, it was the wrong time to be trying to do it 4 or 5 years ago, because the supply-demand balance was very much unbalanced, I would say. That the supply chain was very hungry. There was very low work in oil and gas. Therefore, that supply chain was hungry. And it took on contracts and risk terms that they should never have taken at the time. I mean, I think most of the lawyers and contract specialists in this room today would say, we accepted contracts that we should never have accepted. Certain terms in there. As a young engineer, I was trained, never accept soil conditions. Never, it's rely upon and it's unreliable. For anybody that's a geologist or a geoscientist in this room, I was trained to qualify soil conditions from the first day I joined the industry. But look at the number of companies that have taken on the risk of seabed conditions, and it's come back to bite them over the last period. So I think the industry absolutely said they wanted it. Now the challenge is, how do we do it? So I guess my key call to action is, please take the contract, tell us what's good about it, try to adopt it on your next contracts. But secondly, I've got a call to action here from the various bodies that are working on this. We've launched our contract, we've got our contracting principles. AJ, we're talking to, so we're going to, obviously, we've been asked by Tim Pick to work with OWIC. So we're going to give anything we produce to OWIC and say, here's a starting point. is this something you could adopt? Help us to get adopted within the industry. We've got Offshore Energies UK, we've got Graham and Tracy here in the room from OUK that have logic, so we've based it on logic, so we want to work with them to get a common set of principles and contracts that will be used. BIMCO, we know, are looking at some form of contracts for offshore wind, so again, we've engaged with them and said, let's work together and try and get something that works. FIDIC, we know, have launched early in the summer, they've launched a new committee to prepare or create a new form of standard contracts, but they've publicly said that's going to take probably 2.5 years to do, sometime like the end of 2025. We need something now that's going to be used today for the industry. So we've already engaged with FIDIC. They've told us that we could be perhaps be a consulting partner or we can a review partner, I think the way they described it to us. World Forum Offshore Wind is based in Germany. Some of your companies will be members of WFO. They formed the contracts committee. They're looking at standard principles. We've shared that information with them, and we're actually joined. So Margaret, who heads up our Legal and Contracts Committee, is engaged in that committee as well. So we're going to try and encourage them to give us the feedback, not to develop something else. The last thing we need is 6 forms of contract coming out of this stuff. So what we really want is for all of those industries to come together and to agree on a standard set of principles and hopefully a standard set of contracts, either IMCAs or one that's even better, let's say. So that's my call to action. So thank you, everyone.